in an air-gapped world. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Show of hands if you can hear me. Fantastic. All right, so you can hear me, so you can hear him. So let's quiet down so we can make sure we can hear our speaker. Galen's a federal solutions architect at Chef. He's a self-taught geek from Pacific Northwest. His professional life has been built upon automating everything he can. Currently, he is a federal solutions architect, and he's responsible for helping the federal government, DoD, and associated integrators move into the DevOps space. Currently lives in Arlington, Virginia, and is from Seattle, Washington. Had a stint in Montana, and has extensive experience in Windows, migration, Chef, and Yak. Galen, here you go.
Thank you very much. All right, so as it was said, I'm Galen Emery. I'm the Federal Solution Architect for Chef. And real quick, kind of who am I? I work with the federal government and integrators. Is that DoD, civilian, or intelligence community? The answer is yes. I work with all of them. Some of you I know, some of you I work with on a regular basis. My job is to help people understand how to build and structure their infrastructure, typically using Chef, to solve their problems, right? That's how we operate. That's what I do. I enjoy doing it. I used to be a Windows Server admin, so if you ever hear me talking about Linux, you can probably be like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about? And I go, yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. I didn't manage Linux servers. I managed Windows servers. I've been with Chef for just over 3 years now. I think I just hit the 3-year mark last week. Like I said, I'm born and raised in Seattle. Where's Nathan Harvey? Yeah, you're right there. Yeah, you're wrong about Seattle Crab, man. We got to talk about that. So what we're going to cover today is what is air-gapped, right? Some people here know what this word means. Some people are like, I have no idea what that means. Are you a skater? What's going on here? So then what issues do we encounter? Any assumptions we have as this process? How do we solve it on the technical side? How do we solve it on the process side? And then what about blah? And then some final food for thought. So real quick, air-gapped is a computer that has no access to the internet, right? So this is an example of a nicely air-gapped computer hanging from the ceiling. And so what we have here is systems that are either for security or business reasons. There is some reason this thing doesn't have access to the internet. Who here operates, show of hands, with systems that are air-gapped? All right, so we got a small smattering, a group of people here, right? All right, what about people with man-in-the-middle proxies, corporate proxies that deal with things, right? So here's the other thing we often run into is a corporate proxy of some sort or another. Some of them will inspect your traffic. Some of them do SSL termination, which causes additional issues, additional hats. I see some heads nodding, right? So some additional problems we run into as a result of that. And some of them are a little bit more transparent, not quite so onerous, but they may still include a firewall. So who here, last show of hands, who here has a firewall that blocks access to some sites or others that you think you need to you use on a regular basis, right? So this is the last piece that we deal with here. I've had customers where I walk in, they can get to GitHub, but not just .github.com, and you're like, that's weird. Paste bin is often disallowed. We've seen Ruby gems, other artifact repositories, things like that. So what we find is that we are often, in one way or another, removed from the internet as we know it, right? We're removed from the area that we expect to have access to, expect to get into. Some people didn't raise their hands. So who doesn't have any restrictions? Yeah, I see Nathan Harvey's hands go up, right? So some of us don't, right? Some of us really do operate in places that don't have those proxies, don't have those things, or if they do exist, that they are in fact transparent, and we don't actually have to worry about them on a day-to-day basis, right? They just kind of sit there in the middle and are NAT proxies and do things like that for us. So if you are, that's great. It's fantastic. I think there's still a lot of value you're going to get out of this today because we're going to talk about ways to make things better if those things aren't available. I mean, the internet's pretty stable, right? But we just had S3 and DIN DNS, which if they go down, you might as well just sit around and fight swords XKCD style. So what we're going to talk about now is the issues. What are the issues we run into as we get into this process? So as we're doing this, the first thing we have the issue with is how do we get things into production, right? How do we cross this gap? How do we go from my laptop sitting here, I've got internet access, I can get to all the things, to my production system that is in a lab that I have to walk into, badge into, retina scan, right? All those types of things that we run into as we go through this process. Then once we get it across, how do we distribute it, right? A lot of the tooling that we work with assumes internet access. We have to go through that process as well. And then how do we ensure its integrity, right? This is the thing we is often missed as we talk about this stuff, but it's really critical. Just because I brought it over, it doesn't mean I trust it any more or any less. I need to ensure that I know what I'm bringing across. So process, you want to talk about process? I can't do Jim Mora. That's just not going to happen. My goal here is, right, we want to make one change. That's the first step to this process. The first step is just to make one change to production, one thing that can go through this process to get out to production in our air-gapped environments. By doing that, we start the process of how do we deal with velocity, right? We have some questions we have to ask. We have customers who literally burn a DVD to make a change to production, right? They burn a DVD, they drive up to the base, they go through, they go into the lab, they put it in, and they make the change, right? Or it goes across a satellite connection to some base across the world or somewhere across the world, right? So there's a lot of things we run into as we go through this process. We need to figure out how do we achieve velocity when we're still constrained within these approaches, within these pieces here. Or if it's not that restrictive, but you have a proxy and it's expecting all your packets, how do I ensure that when I have to download packages that it works and it does so quickly? All right, I may not be air-gapped, but here's some things I might have going on, right? So here's the other things we're going to run into as we go through this. Firewall between the systems and the internet, proxy inspects all the traffics, or another common thing we run into is level of access necessary, right? You don't get root on your production systems, and that really restricts, or even sometimes on your laptop, it really restricts the ability you have to make things happen. Or, and this is the one I think I've been running into more often than not, is the tool itself that we're working with doesn't understand the proxy we need to go through, right? How many people run into authenticating proxies? I saw a couple of hands shoot right up. So yeah, we have things, and a lot of the tooling doesn't understand the authenticating proxy. It knows how to go through a proxy, but doesn't know how to authenticate it to it. If you had to do two-factor, do SAML, like a lot of them don't have that tooling built into it. All right, some real quick ground rules about the things. I'm going to talk about some assumptions we're making as we go through this process. The first one is that you know, that I know, that you know how to get code into production, right? That's not what this talk is about. It's not about how do we actually cross that gap as a physical medium, if it's a DVD, if it's SSH, whatever it is, right? You know how to solve that problem internally. If you don't know how to solve that problem, come talk to us and we'll figure it out, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. The other assumption is that everything is code, okay? Repeat after me. Everything is code. If we put it all into code, it all works really well. So if it's source code, it goes into source code management. If it's an artifact, it goes into an artifact store, and we have a checksum associated with it. We can and do write tests, and we build a pipeline, right? These are the key components of making sure we get safety as we go through to production. All right, so at a high level, this is the solution that we have to work with. This is what we typically do. First step is we're going from low to high, okay? If you're not familiar, low side is the unsecured side, high side is the secured side. We're gonna move things from the low environment up into the high environment. We never go from high to low, because high side has data. Data is the important part, and we'll get to that in just a second. The second piece is assume you don't have the internet. As you build your pipeline, as you build your systems in development, you need to build them in a way that they don't assume they have access to the internet. If production doesn't have access to the internet, neither does development, right? Your laptop, your individual laptop, should absolutely, you as an individual should have access to the internet. Your systems should not. So if you build this into the pipeline, your systems are built in a way that they don't assume access to the internet, that they assume that you have to mirror everything locally, and you test it on the low side, you're going to be pretty successful. The problem is that most tooling, by default, assumes it has access to the internet. So there's a couple things we have to do to make sure that happens. The first thing, again, is make sure we do this work on the low side, right? And the key here is that development needs to match production. We already know this. We already understand this concept. And it's even more critical when we're dealing with air-gapped systems. We have to make sure that development and the way we build development is exactly the same way as we build production. The key structure here is that, again, if we can do this in dev, we can do it in prod. The next piece is we protect the data, not the infrastructure, okay? Oftentimes we go into places and they're like, I can't give you out how I build my production systems. That's not the important part. How you build a production system is not the important part, because you build it the same way you do in production as you do in development, right? That code should already be in development and not in production. The data is the thing we care about. The data, the PII, the credit cards, right? All that information is the stuff that we're actually paying attention to and actually worrying about, and that's the thing we're going to protect, and that's the thing we're going to make sure never leaves our high-side environment. All right, so how do we actually make this happen, right? What are the things we need to do this and do this effectively? The first thing we need is we need some sort of workstation. We need a place that we can use as a loading dock to get into this environment and to work inside of this environment, okay? So the idea here is that everything should come through this workstation. This should be the point of entry for all code going into production. It's going to need a way to serve files, either directly or indirectly. It's going to need a way to create some artifacts so we can work with them as we go through the process. And we should be building it programmatically, right? Because we're going to use the same workstation concept both in development and in production. We're going to need these same concepts as we go across that gap. So we're going to use the workstation to stand up the artifact repository, stand up whatever your configuration management or deployment infrastructure is going to be, and then you're going to publish your artifacts, and you can also use this to run your tests against your systems, right? And we'll talk about that in just a second. So I work for Chef, so this is a Chef-specific example. This operates with any configuration management tool you'd like to use, right? There's no restriction there. I just don't know how to use those other tools to make this happen, but I'm happy to help as much as I can. So when we do it with Chef, we do this. We bring into the workstation a zip or a tar with the following things. We have Chef DK, some sort of FTP or SSH or SCP server if you're using Windows, because they don't already exist. But if you're on Linux, those things typically already exist on disk. You can work with them there. Your cookbooks or policy you're going to use to stand up your infrastructure and do your deployments. Any gems or packages or artifacts you need as part of this process. And then in our case, we're using some Chef packages, Chef Client, and Chef Server. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a thing called Chef Zero, which runs Chef without a server, to build this workstation up by itself, get the FTP server up, get these things up and running, and that we can make things happen as the rest of it goes. This FTP server or SCP server that you build is not for your production artifacts. It's not your artifact repository. It's just a way so that you can get code and artifacts out to your initial set of infrastructure and build it up, right? It's just there to bootstrap this process. So what about dependencies, right? Maybe I brought across some gems, and I brought across some artifacts, and I went to install it, and it failed. And I went and I grabbed the next one, and I go to install it, and it fails, right? We have this problem. We have the problem of dependency trees, dependency maps. This example here is based on Ruby gems, which can be painful because when you go to download when you download one, it doesn't tell you what dependencies it has until you go to install it. So you have to figure that out. So a couple ways we can get around this. I could just skip the gem, right? Depending on what it's doing, I might just be able to go out to Bash or PowerShell and just make it happen. I'll just do that. It's not desired state, doesn't really do what we want to do, and there are plenty of cases where it's going to be way more complicated to do it that way. So we really don't want to do that. All right. Well, I could just create a full mirror of Ruby gems. That's only 80,000 gems. Do I really want that in my high-side environment? Do I really want all of that code that I have no idea what it does and doesn't serve me any purpose? No, I really don't want that either. So I can always just take what I need, install it into a directory, and then archive that up and send it across. And so for proof of concept, that's what you can do, right? That's the simplest way to get this across. There's a gem command. You can install it into a directory, take a tar of that, and it works, right? And then you can drop that into your directory, your Ruby path on your other systems, and it works. It's not great, right? It's really not great. You shouldn't actually do this in production, but as you're getting started, as you do this the first time, this is the simplest way to make that happen. And what you're really going to want to do is build an artifact repo, right? You need an artifact store of some sort. Artifactory is really great. It's probably the most commonly one that we use. And it allows for the Ruby gem dependency paths. So you can have it resolve all your dependencies for you. You don't have to resolve them yourself. Also allows you to version your artifacts, which is really critical, and it supports the dependency structure. All right, So we have the work. So you build that up. You have the workstation. You have an artifact repository at this point. And now we need to spin up the rest of the infrastructure. We need to continue on and get the rest of this up and running. And the way we do that with Chef is I prefer using Chef provisioning SSH. What this does is it makes an SSH command across to a set of systems that I tell it to. It will go install Chef on those systems. I can tell it where to get the Chef client from, so I can go tell it to grab it from that artifact store or from my little running FTP server on my workstation. And then it can bootstrap my Chef server infrastructure. So I can build up Chef server, I can build all those things up and make them ready and available for the rest of the nodes, the rest of the systems to come in and grab. Again, this is the same process if you're standing up any other configuration management tool or any other deployment tool, right? Just build it up, make it available, and then you can start the process of things going. So we've done that, all right? So we built the workstation, we built the artifact repository, we've got our configuration management up. We're good, right? Not quite. The last thing, again, is that our systems, by default, when we build them up, they assume they have internet access. There's a lot of things we need to do to remove that assumption from the system itself. So a couple of the things that are really critical is removing your unreachable satellite repositories, right? Setting up, again, potentially setting up local ones, making sure that you have access to all of them. A common one on Ruby is to remove rubygems.org from your source and then add your local repository. It's a really effective way to make sure your systems don't try to resolve dependencies against Ruby gems. Makes it really simple and easy. If you're using Chef, Burks files by default include the public supermarket. You should run your own internal supermarket. You can actually run that on Artifactory now, so you don't have to set up a separate server. So it can be all built together. And the basic idea is this, right? If you're using this tool X, and it has a way, it grabs things from Y, update that to Z, right? Straightforward. There's a lot of tools out there that make a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of different ways to catch those. And again, what we want to do is we want to do this on the dev side. If we do it on dev, then we have the ability to make sure that this thing is not going to try to reach out to weird sites in prod, regardless of if we're air-gapped or not. All right. Some of you might be asking, what if I have a proxy, right? I can just poke holes to the proxy, right? Why don't I do that versus all this mirroring crap? That's just seems like way more work than it should be. Well, here's the reason why I don't advocate that for most cases. A lot of tools do support HTTP proxy and HTTPS proxy, right? They work it pretty well. The problem is there's two things. One is if your proxy is doing man-in-the-middle inspection, it's going to slow you down, right? And it's going to do it every time you grab that package. So every time you build a system, you bring down Chef, you bring down Puppet, you bring down anything, it's going to go through and inspect that package every single time. We don't really want to inherit that delay every time we want to build a new system or every time we want to make a change. So if we just go through it once and then bring things internally and run it internally, that's a lot better for us overall. And the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that don't support authenticating proxies. That all being said, if you've got a team that'll work with you and you can poke the holes necessary out to GitHub, to Chef, to Ruby gems, to Artifactory, right? All the things you would need, then go ahead, right? Like that's definitely the best approach if you have that available to you. Some of us do not. All right, so that's the high level of how we do it on the technical side. So how do we change the process, right? There's a bunch of pieces to this process that can be very difficult or very slow to getting us out to production. First step, do it in dev. I can't stress this enough. The closer you bring this to you, the easier it is for you to find out about an issue and the faster it is for you to fix it. Along these same lines, harden dev to the same standards as production, right? If production doesn't allow SSH access, SSH password-based access, then remove it in dev, right? Force people to use key-based access. Force people to use Protocol 2. Do the things you do in production that you do in development. This is going to ensure that you actually have a working copy of what development is, of what production is. We want to create and use pipelines, CI and CD pipelines. We want to use unit and integration tests. This is going to allow us to make sure we don't break things as we try to go to production, to make sure we don't have any regressions when we go to harden our systems and deal with that process. And I think this is pretty important. Identify where you're assuming risk. If you're letting people log into systems in production, you're assuming risk there. You're assuming risk in production, right? That's where people make changes. That's where it's possible for things to go wrong. If you put it into a pipeline, you're assuming risk at the front end of that pipeline. Somebody has to commit code, somebody else reviews the code, and then somebody else ships the code. That's a different risk model than talking into production directly. So this is the scenario I try to get my customers to. Very few are here yet, but we're working on it. This is the scenario that I'd love to see. Nobody ever logs into a production system. Production is actually set up in a way that SSH and RDP access are not allowed. They're disallowed on the box. All changes flow through the pipeline that tracks who committed, reviewed, and delivered the change. All changes get tested through dev, QA, and deployed to prod. And then ideally, we have on-demand compute, and we can build a new production, right? The system itself doesn't live long enough for it to be a risk factor in and of itself. So we can do all these things only through infrastructure as code. Yeah, but like, what about this thing? Like, I'm a special snowflake. My laptop can't get out. Well, yeah, that's a problem, right? If we're in situations where you as an individual can't reach out to GitHub, can't reach out to Ruby Gems, can't get to or Slack, can't get to the places that you need to get to do your job, then yeah, we need to have a conversation about that, right? We need to figure out what's going on, what is the risk that people think that we're assuming, and how do we resolve for that problem, right? That's a process problem, not a tooling problem. You try and security doesn't let you, right? They're like, no, nah, not gonna do it, okay? Here's the key. Work with them, not against them. Don't treat them as the adversary. They should be a critical part of your business. If they're not, then that's something to work on and think about. If you haven't read the Phoenix Project does a really good job of talking about why this is important, talking about how do we get people to think about it in the right way, to think about delivering business value, right? And again, identify where the risk is. If the risk is on the production systems, that's one thing. If the risk is we can put it through a pipeline and can track it, then maybe other things open up for us. And that's typically what we see, is that when you move the risk forward, when you move the risk to the left, to the early part of the process, we find that security is a little bit more fluid because they can see all the changes that are happening. It becomes much easier to track what the changes are to the system, and we're bringing them into the process. Again, consume that risk in dev, not in prod. We want to fail fast. And then lastly, progress is coming, right? We see this across the industry. People are realizing that the way we did things before doesn't work. It's too slow. It's too burdensome. And just kind of hold tight, keep pushing. It will happen, right? We are on the cusp of making that happen. Another question we typically ask ourselves in this is, how often do we update our packages? If I am building a process that goes from an internet-connected workstation, brings things down, and then moves them across the air gap, how often do I do that? How do I make that happen? How do I automate that? That's a key component of this whole structure. We need to make sure we solve that part of the process as well. And the key to this is that we're going to do this by running it through a pipeline in development, and then we're going to move it out to production. Where are the gates? So when we make a change to production, where are the places that we stop and have someone look at the change before we go make that change forward, right? We typically believe in 2 gates at Chef. We believe in a code review early on in the process. So if I write code, Nathan looks at it. And then we believe into a human gate to deliver the change. So if Nathan looked at the code, then Chris over there makes the decision to change it as he's the business owner, right? Make those decisions in your pipeline and your processes of who makes these changes and where do we put the humans in the process. Lastly, as we're dealing with this, as we're looking at this and we're working with our teams and our business, what are the metrics? What are the things that the business cares about? And how do we drive those metrics? How do we get ourselves into this business value conversation? That's what's going to allow us to solve the technical side of doing DevOps in the air-gapped world. So velocity is how fast we ship. How frequently are we shipping? We're doing it on demand. When we make a commit, how long does it take for that commit to get to production? Efficiency is how good are we, right? Do we have failures in production? If we do have a failure, how long does it take us to fix it? And then risk is, what's our compliance footprint? How confident are we that our systems are in fact compliant, that we're testing for compliance through every stage of this process? And if we aren't, if we have an issue or if a 0-day happens, how long does it take for us to fix it? What is the time delay between we know about an issue and we fix the issue out in production? All right, so real quick, my time's almost up. Some final food for thought. Alaskan king crab. All right. It's the biggest of all crabs. It's the king of crabs. So, Alaskan king crab is served steamed or chilled with lemon and butter. You do not need Old Bay. Its fishing season is in October and January. That's when it's freshest. Go hit it up then. The other one is Dungeness crab. Again, steamed or chilled with lemon or butter. Blue crab is crab feast, all right? Yes, absolutely. Blue crab is awesome. It is hashtag crab feast for sure. It is served with Old Bay. Old Bay is delicious. You do not use Old Bay on Alaskan king crab, all right? Let's be very clear. All right, so real quick, if anybody would like the proof of concept code on a USB key, please raise your hand. Okay? Go Google Stuxnet or Vault 7. And please have your security clearance revoked. No USB keys. Don't take USB keys from conferences, all right? Final acknowledgments. I need to thank Rob Kidd, who's one of my colleagues over there. He did a talk similar to this back in ChefConf 2014 called Mind the Gap, how to deploy Chef in unforgiving environments. And lastly, I want to thank the people who I work with, who I cannot name, and DevOps Days Baltimore. Thank you for having me.